"You don't belong here." The words sliced through the hum of the airport like a knife. Captain Naomi Williams froze, her pilot's hat tucked under her arm, her navy blue uniform with its gold-trimmed sleeves gleaming under the terminal lights. The woman behind the counter, a blonde in a white button-up shirt and navy trousers, stared at her with a look that was equal parts disdain and disbelief. "Excuse me?" Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "You'll have to wait outside," the woman repeated, her tone icy. "Pilots aren't allowed here." Naomi's jaw tightened. She had heard variations of this before, subtle comments, sideways glances, but never something so blatant. She held up her ID, the gold insignia catching the light. "I am the pilot," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Captain Naomi Williams, this is my flight." The woman didn't even glance at the ID. "You'll have to wait outside," she said again, her tone final, as if the matter were settled. Around them, passengers paused, their eyes darting between Naomi and the staff member. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Naomi's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "Ma'am," Naomi said, her voice low but firm, "if I'm not the pilot, then who is?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her computer, her fingers tapping furiously on the keyboard. Naomi stood her ground, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. She had spent years proving herself, but it was clear that wasn't enough. As the supervisor finally arrived, Naomi's mind was already racing. This wasn't just another incident to brush off. This was the moment she decided enough was enough. Naomi Williams had always been drawn to the sky. As a little girl growing up in a small town, she would lie on the grassy field behind her house, watching planes carve white trails across the blue expanse. Her father, a mechanic who worked on crop dusters, would often take her to the local airstrip. There, she'd sit for hours, mesmerized by the roar of engines and the sight of planes lifting off into the horizon. "One day, that'll be you up there," her father would say, pointing to the sky. His words planted a seed in her young mind, a dream that would grow into an unshakable determination. But the path to the cockpit wasn't easy. As a black girl in a predominantly white town, Naomi faced skepticism at every turn. When she told her high school guidance counselor she wanted to be a pilot, the woman chuckled and said, "Don't you think that's a bit unrealistic? Maybe you should consider something more practical." Naomi didn't let the comment deter her. She worked tirelessly, excelling in math and science, and saving every penny from her part-time job at the local diner to pay for flying lessons. At 17, she earned her private pilot's license, becoming the youngest person and the only black woman in her town to do so. Her journey through aviation school was no less challenging. She was often the only woman of color in her classes, and the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle biases of her peers and instructors were a constant reminder of the barriers she faced. But Naomi refused to be intimidated. She studied harder, flew longer hours, and graduated at the top of her class. Her first job at a regional airline was a milestone, but it came with its own set of challenges. Passengers would often mistake her for a flight attendant, and some even requested to speak to the real pilot. Colleagues would question her decisions in the cockpit, their tone laced with doubt. But Naomi persevered, earning the respect of her peers and the trust of her passengers through her skill and professionalism. Now, at 34, Naomi was a captain for one of the largest airlines in the country. She had logged thousands of flight hours, navigated through storms, and safely landed planes in emergencies. Her uniform, navy blue with gold accents, was a symbol of her hard-earned success. But no matter how high she climbed, the shadow of prejudice always seemed to follow her. The morning of the incident started like any other. Naomi arrived at the airport, her pilot's hat tucked under her arm, her braids neatly pulled back. She nodded at the security staff as she passed through the employee entrance, her ID badge swinging from her lanyard. The terminal was bustling with passengers, the air filled with the hum of conversation and the occasional announcement over the loudspeaker. As she approached the check-in counter for her flight, she noticed the woman behind the desk, a blonde in her late 30s, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her white button-up shirt crisp and professional. The woman was busy typing on her computer, her expression focused but cold. "Good morning," Naomi said, placing her ID and flight details on the counter. "Captain Naomi Williams, reporting for duty." The woman glanced up, her eyes scanning Naomi from head to toe. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without a word, she pushed the ID back across the counter. "You'll have to wait outside," she said, her tone dismissive. "Pilots aren't allowed here." Naomi blinked, momentarily stunned. She had heard variations of this before, subtle comments, sideways glances, but never something so blatant. She took a deep breath, her training kicking in. "Stay calm. Stay professional." "I am the pilot," she said, her voice steady but firm. She gestured to her uniform, the gold buttons gleaming under the terminal lights. "This is my flight." The woman's expression didn't change. "You'll have to wait outside," she repeated, her tone final, as if the matter were settled. Naomi felt a surge of anger, but she pushed it down. She glanced around, noticing the curious stares of passengers nearby. Some were whispering, others filming on their phones. The weight of their attention made her skin crawl, but she refused to back down. "Ma'am," she said, her voice low but clear, "I am the captain of this flight. I have the credentials, the uniform, and the authority to be here. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with your supervisor." The woman's face flushed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her computer, her fingers tapping furiously on the keyboard. Naomi stood her ground, her heart pounding but her expression calm. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. As she waited, a young black girl in the line caught her eye. The girl was staring at her, wide-eyed, clutching her mother's hand. Naomi gave her a small, reassuring smile. In that moment she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. When the supervisor finally arrived, Naomi explained the situation, her voice steady but firm. The supervisor apologized profusely, but the damage was done. As Naomi walked away, her mind was already racing. She had spent years proving herself, but it was clear that wasn't enough. It was time to take action. Naomi spent the rest of her shift in a haze, her mind replaying the incident at the check-in counter. The dismissive tone of the staff member, the cold stare, the blatant disregard for her authority, it all gnawed at her. She had faced prejudice before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a microaggression or a thoughtless comment. This was a direct challenge to her identity, her career, her very existence in the cockpit. As soon as her flight landed, Naomi went straight to the airline's HR department. She filed a formal complaint, detailing the incident with precision and professionalism. She included the names of witnesses, the time and location, and even the reactions of the passengers who had recorded the encounter. She expected swift action, or at the very least, an acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. Instead, she was met with apathy. The HR representative, a middle-aged man with a practiced smile, listened to her complaint with a detached air. He nodded sympathetically, typed a few notes into his computer, and assured her that the matter would be looked into. But his tone lacked conviction, and his words felt hollow. "We take these matters very seriously," he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. "But you have to understand, these situations can be complicated. We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation." Naomi left the office feeling frustrated and dismissed. Days turned into weeks, and she heard nothing from HR. When she followed up, she was told the investigation was ongoing and that she should be patient. Meanwhile, the staff member who had confronted her continued to work at the check-in counter, her demeanor as cold and dismissive as ever. Naomi's frustration grew, but what hurt more was the lack of support from her colleagues. When she mentioned the incident to a fellow pilot, a white man in his 40s, he shrugged it off. "That's just how she is," he said, not looking up from his pre-flight checklist. "Don't take it personally." Another colleague, a flight attendant who had witnessed the incident, avoided the topic altogether. "I don't want to get involved," she said nervously. "It's not worth the trouble." Naomi felt isolated, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to rise above the biases and stereotypes. But this time, it felt impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Naomi called her older sister, Maya. Maya had always been her rock, the one person who understood her struggles and never hesitated to speak her mind. "I don't know what to do," Naomi admitted, her voice trembling with frustration. "I've filed a complaint, but nothing's happening. No one cares." "Of course they don't," Maya said bluntly. "They don't want to care. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting." "What's the point?" Naomi asked, her voice breaking. "Nothing ever changes. The point," Maya said firmly, "is that you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every little girl who dreams of being a pilot, but gets told it's unrealistic. You're fighting for every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. And you're fighting because you're not the kind of person who lets injustice slide." Maya's words struck a chord. Naomi had always been a fighter, but somewhere along the way, she had started to doubt herself. She had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the system was too big, too entrenched, to change. But Maya was right. Giving up wasn't an option. Determined to take action, Naomi began reaching out to other minority employees at the airline. She started with the flight attendants, many of whom were women of color. At first, they were hesitant to talk, fearing retaliation or dismissal. But as Naomi shared her own story, they began to open up. One flight attendant, a Latina woman named Maria, recounted how she had been passed over for promotions despite her years of experience. "They always say, 'I'm not ready,'" she said bitterly. "But the white girls with half my experience get promoted all the time." Another employee, a black man named Jamal who worked in baggage handling, told Naomi about the constant microaggressions he faced. "They call me boy and act like I'm invisible," he said. "But if I say anything, I'm the one who gets in trouble." As Naomi listened to their stories, a pattern began to emerge. The discrimination wasn't isolated to a few bad apples. It was systemic, ingrained in the very fabric of the company. Minority employees were consistently overlooked for promotions, subjected to harsher scrutiny, and treated with blatant disrespect. And when they spoke up, they were silenced or ignored. Naomi began documenting everything. She collected written testimonies, recorded conversations, and gathered data on promotions and disciplinary actions. She discovered that while minority employees made up a significant portion of the workforce, they were severely underrepresented in leadership positions. The numbers were damning, and the stories were heartbreaking. But the more evidence she gathered, the more dangerous her mission became. She started to notice subtle changes in how she was treated at work. Her schedule was suddenly filled with inconvenient shifts, and her requests for time off were routinely denied. Colleagues who had once been friendly now avoided her, and she could feel the weight of their stares whenever she walked into a room. One day, as she was leaving the airport, she found a note tucked under her windshield wiper. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. "Stop stirring up trouble. You're not going to win." Naomi's hands shook as she read the note, but she refused to be intimidated. If anything, it only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Maria, for Jamal, for every person who had ever been silenced. The breaking point came during a meeting with HR. Naomi had requested an update on her complaint, but instead of answers, she was met with excuses. "We've looked into the matter," the HR representative said, his tone dismissive. "But there's no evidence of wrongdoing. Without proof, there's nothing we can do." Naomi stared at him, her anger boiling over. "No evidence?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "I gave you names, times, locations. I gave you witnesses. What more do you need?" The representative shifted uncomfortably. "These situations are complicated," he said, repeating the same tired line. "We have to consider all sides." "All sides?" Naomi snapped. "What other side is there? I was humiliated in front of dozens of people, and you're telling me there's no evidence of wrongdoing?" The representative didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Naomi realized then that the airline would never change, not unless someone forced them to. That night, she made her decision. She would leak the evidence to the media. It was a risky move, one that could cost her her job, her reputation, even her career. But she was done playing by their rules. If the airline wouldn't listen to her, maybe the world would. She spent hours compiling the evidence into a detailed report, complete with testimonies, data, and her own account of the incident at the check-in counter. She sent it to a journalist she trusted, along with a simple message: "This needs to be heard." As she hit send, a wave of relief washed over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she was in control. Whatever happened next, she was ready. The story broke early on a Monday morning. By noon, it was everywhere. News outlets, social media platforms, and talk shows were abuzz with the revelations about the airline's discriminatory practices. Headlines screamed, "Pilot exposes systemic racism at major airline," and "Captain Naomi Williams takes a stand against injustice." Passengers who had witnessed the incident at the check-in counter came forward, sharing their videos and accounts. Activists and advocacy groups amplified the story, calling for boycotts and protests. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Naomi and hashtag Fly with Equality trended worldwide, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in the aviation industry. At the airport, the atmosphere was tense. Protesters gathered outside the terminal, holding signs that read, "Racism has no place in the skies," and "Stand with Captain Williams." Passengers waiting for their flights watched the scene unfold, some joining the protests, others recording on their phones. Inside the airline's headquarters, executives scrambled to contain the fallout. Emails and phone calls flooded in, demanding answers and accountability. Stock prices plummeted as investors grew nervous. The company's PR team worked overtime, but no amount of spin could undo the damage. For Naomi, the response was overwhelming. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from colleagues, strangers, and even other pilots. One message, from a young black girl who dreamed of becoming a pilot, brought her to tears. "Thank you for standing up for us. You're my hero." But not everyone was supportive. Some colleagues accused her of making a scene or damaging the company's reputation. Anonymous comments on social media questioned her motives and dismissed her claims. But Naomi refused to let the negativity get to her. She had known this would happen, and she was ready. 3 days after the story broke, Naomi held a press conference. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and supporters, their cameras and microphones trained on her as she stepped up to the podium. She wore her pilot's uniform, the gold accents gleaming under the bright lights, her braids pulled back neatly under her hat. She looked every bit the captain she was. For a moment, she paused, taking in the sea of faces before her. Then she began to speak, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Captain Naomi Williams," she said, "and I've been a pilot for over a decade. Flying has always been my passion, my dream. But for as long as I can remember, that dream has been shadowed by the reality of discrimination." She recounted the incident at the check-in counter, her words painting a vivid picture of the humiliation and frustration she had felt. She spoke of the countless times she had been mistaken for anything but a pilot, the subtle and not-so-subtle biases she had faced, and the systemic racism that permeated the industry. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "This is about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Every employee who has been overlooked, silenced, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. Every child who has been told their dreams are unrealistic. This is about justice. This is about equality. This is about change." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, applause began to build, growing into a thunderous roar. Cameras flashed, and journalists scrambled to capture the moment. Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I didn't do this for fame or recognition," she continued. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because silence is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit anymore." She ended her speech with a call to action, urging the airline to take responsibility and implement real change. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning, and I won't stop fighting until every person, regardless of their race or gender, can pursue their dreams without fear of discrimination." As she stepped away from the podium, the room erupted into cheers. Reporters shouted questions, but Naomi didn't stop. She had said what she needed to say. The airline had no choice but to respond. The day after the press conference, the CEO issued a public statement, apologizing for the unacceptable behavior and promising to take immediate action. The staff member who had confronted Naomi was suspended pending an investigation, and the company announced a series of reforms, including mandatory diversity training, stricter anti-discrimination policies, and the creation of a task force to address systemic issues. But the public wasn't satisfied. Protests continued, and calls for boycotts grew louder. Passengers canceled their flights, and competitors seized the opportunity to promote their own commitment to diversity and inclusion. For Naomi, the response was bittersweet. She was glad the airline was finally taking steps in the right direction, but she knew the fight was far from over. Real change would take time, and she was determined to see it through. In the weeks that followed, Naomi became a symbol of courage and resilience. She was invited to speak at conferences, featured in magazines, and even approached by other airlines offering her leadership positions. But she declined, choosing instead to start her own initiative to support minority pilots and aviation professionals. As she stood on the tarmac one evening, watching a plane take off into the sunset, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She had taken a stand, and the world had listened. The airline, under immense public pressure, implemented sweeping changes. Diversity training became mandatory for all employees, and stricter anti-discrimination policies were put in place. A task force was created to address systemic issues, and minority employees were finally given a platform to voice their concerns. It was a step in the right direction, but Naomi knew the fight was far from over. When the airline offered her a leadership position to help lead these changes, she declined. "I didn't do this for a promotion," she told them. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Instead, she started her own initiative, Wings of Change, to support minority pilots and aviation professionals. The organization provided scholarships, mentorship programs, and a safe space for people to share their stories. It was her way of ensuring that no one else would have to fight this battle alone. Months later, Naomi found herself back in the cockpit, preparing for another flight. As she ran through the pre-flight checklist, she glanced out at the runway, the early morning sun casting a golden glow over the tarmac. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. The weight of the past few months had been heavy, but it had also been worth it. As the plane lifted off, she smiled to herself. She had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, and in doing so, she had paved the way for others to follow. The skies ahead were clear, and for Naomi, that was enough. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to say, "Enough is enough."